The new Selmer Signature saxophone. Why is it being ignored, guys? Over to my right here, we have two splendid examples of black lacquer Selmers. One is a Signature, one is a Supreme. But it's the Supreme that's getting all the love. And this little guy on my right here is getting slightly ignored. So today, we're going to put a spotlight on this instrument and try and understand why this may be the case. So before we get going with the main thrust of this video, first of all, I just want to show off and show you this wonderful black Signature sax I have in my hand here. And it's very rare, actually, that we have two black finishes of these top-level Selmer saxes. And so I just want to compare and contrast the Signature on my left to the Supreme on my right, and just show you how wonderful these engravings are. We've got this Art Deco style engraving on the left here on the Signature, and then we've got this more intricate floral and cube-like engraving on the Supreme. And don't they just look absolutely wonderful on the black finish? So that's the gloating out the way, but now on to the serious stuff. Talking about the Signature and what it actually means for tenor players. So there's a little bit of a departure here from the alto story. As I mentioned in a previous video on the Signature alto, with the alto we've got the evolution of the Series 2 with the Signature model. The Signature model on the tenor is actually the evolution of the Series 3. So why have Selmer done this? Well, the way I see it is this is a very purposeful decision on the part of Selmer to recognize the fact that they'd had so much success with these two models over the years. And they didn't want to perhaps do what they did with the Mark VI many years ago, where it was extremely successful, but then they just stopped the production. Of course, years later, we're all still talking about the Mark VI. So rather than do that with the really successful Series 2 and Series 3 instruments, they have just decided to keep those models going, but actually improve them and optimize them in the shape of these new Signature models. So it's just really important to get that key messaging across, because from a distance, you might just think, oh, Selmer have trashed the former models. They're onto a new batch of instruments. We've got the Supreme, which of course we talk about in separate conversations, and now we have the Signature. But the Signature is very much doing a different thing. As I say, it's this evolution of the Series 2 and Series 3, so popular, and why not play on the success of some really successful instruments that people have loved over the decades. So to me, it makes perfect sense. Today, I just want to put a spotlight on this instrument and check it out acoustically, as well as talk about a few things to do with how it feels, comparing it with the very obvious Supreme right at the top of the pile. So let's get going. Okay, so first up, just a word on the ergonomics before I get onto the all-important sound. So interestingly, and I had forgotten about this since my initial testings with these two instruments, there is quite a different feel about the Signature compared to the Supreme. I couldn't work out what it was at first, and then I got the ruler stick out and measured the distance between the B pearl key and the G pearl key, because I just couldn't work out why it felt different on the left hand in particular. And I realized actually that this key cluster here on the left measures 68 millimeters from the B to the G on the Signature, whereas it's only 63 millimeters on the Supreme. And I thought it felt a little bit more nimble, but I just couldn't work it out. I sort of, when I went onto the Supreme, I was kind of missing the G key a little bit because I was so used to this. So I suppose my conclusion here is that the Supreme has been designed perhaps with smaller hands in mind, certainly on the left-hand side of things. On the right-hand side, it's more similar. And also just the feeling that you have when you place your fingertips on the keys is that you've actually got more defined edges around the edges of the pearl on the Supreme in comparison to the Signature, which has just a slightly rounder and smoother feeling. Now, this is just all this kind of tactile stuff. It's just stuff you notice as you move from one to the other. It doesn't radically make me sort of reject one sax or love one sax over the other. It's just observations as you move from one to the other. But there are those obvious differences. Aside from that, in terms of ergonomics and action, okay, I do like the overall feel and the comfort, and the key layout and design does feel great, actually, on both of them. No issues there, and I'm loving things, just like I said with the alto video, I'm loving things like this octave key. It feels so flush against the button here. There's no double action, it's so smooth, and in general, actually, everything is just so quiet. It's got that nice sort of dull thud. You hear that, which you get with a really well-designed saxophone. No kind of clackiness, no double action. It's very smooth. For me, the actual key action is just a little on the heavy side, which I do often find with modern horns. I would be taking this instrument, the Signature, which I have in front of me, and the Supreme off to my right, to a technician, just to have particularly the left-hand side lightened up. I just find on the top key here, the auxiliary F, it's quite heavy, and I'm actually using a bit more force to hold that down because there's some kind of resistance pushing my finger upwards as I'm just trying to play in a relaxed kind of playing style. So I can't quite relax on the left hand in order to play in the way that I naturally would want to play. Might suit other players who play with more of a kind of muscular feel, but to me, I would need that all just lightened up to be optimized for me. Again, these are personal preference things, but I thought I'd point it out because this is my instant reaction to these instruments as I'm trying them kind of off the shelf, if you like. Okay, so now onto the stuff that really counts for many of us, and that is the sound. So for me, there's a very obvious change of character from the Signature to the Supreme. And I hear it more at the start of my trying session. So in the first 5 or 10 seconds of playing, when I shift from one sax to the other, I get an immediately different feeling in terms of that immediate tone and response. On the Signature, I get this extra sort of warmth and layers in the sound, more of an expansive sound, perhaps a little more breadth to the sound. Whereas on the Supreme, it's like I feel that there's a sort of front on the start of each note. There's more of a definition and perhaps a focus. But behind all of that, when you just start loosening off and warming into each saxophone and kind of feeling out its character, they both end up sounding pretty similar. You can tell they're Selmer instruments, modern Selmer instruments with a shared sort of sound concept. But those kind of characteristic differences that I just described are immediately apparent at the front of each note, and particularly when I, as I say, move from one instrument to the other. Whether you hear it as much as I feel it when I'm playing it here in front of the camera, it's very obvious to me that difference. And prior to going in to shoot this video, I did the switch over several times to make sure I was really sure about that. And every time I did it, I really did feel those characteristic differences. In recent times, Jamie and I were fortunate enough to go and visit the Selmer Paris factory, and our minds were honestly blown away by what we witnessed during the day. Just the amount of processes, the different stages of production, the mixture of old school craftsmanship and modern technology was honestly mind-blowing. And every time I see a modern Selmer now, I'm reminded of that experience, and I now know what it is that goes into these instruments. In a way, I sort of appreciate them in a different way. And we saw, actually, at the time of this visit, the Signature was a secret model. We couldn't talk about it. We knew it was coming out, but we couldn't tell you guys. But we saw these in production, as well as seeing the Supremes and the other instruments as well, the Axoses, etc. And really, what I want to point out is that the Signature model is produced in exactly the same way as the Supreme. There isn't a different process that's reserved for the Supreme, which makes it that much better of an instrument. Yes, it's more expensive, but there are not these additional refined processes like you might imagine that are tagged onto the Supreme to give it that, well, supremacy. It's not true. They are simply two saxophone models, and they both depart in their own directions, and as I say, they both have their own character and personality. So hopefully I've given you some thoughts here which might spur you on to thinking, perhaps I shouldn't have this automatic bias towards the Supreme because it is the most expensive instrument. Perhaps you can reevaluate your balancing of these two instruments and how they fit into the Selmer structure of instruments. I've certainly enjoyed this test today because I'm reminded that they're just both so good, and the key thing that binds them both in the Selmer umbrella is the fact that they have this very shared sound. You can really hear those tonal qualities shared in both instruments, but the fact that they just depart in different directions as I've described. So perhaps if you're looking for more of a focused sound and you like that kind of Mark VI-like sort of centered sound, the Supreme, for me, feels like it's going a little bit more in that direction. And then with the breadth and the width of the sound that I've described with the new Signature, we're departing in a different direction. You know, that's the kind of sound that you're looking for. But I still come back to the point that, you know, these are great instruments and they really do everything. So I'm not keen to kind of tie one saxophone down to a particular playing style and the other to another playing style. They will both play in any playing style you choose. There's enough flexibility in both instruments, but these are the characteristics that move the saxophones in different directions. Ultimately, if you can come down to the store to try out these saxophones, that would be absolutely great. But otherwise, we have these available to buy online, and we're more than happy to answer your questions about the traits of each individual sax and which one may suit you more.